Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Ditch the clowns on the left
and the jokers on the right,
and join Michael Smerconish right here in the middle.
This is the Smerconish Podcast for independent minds.
TC, welcome back to the Daily Podcast.
Oh my. Well, thank you so much.
You're probably wondering why you've been summoned.
Why have I been summoned to the Smerconish Daily Podcast?
I want you to help me.
A place I like to be.
I want you to help me jog my memory about the case of Adnan Syed and cereal.
Oh my.
So today, the Baltimore Sun, here's the headline: Baltimore prosecutors move to vacate Adnan Syed conviction in 1999 murder case brought to national fame in serial podcast. And it says, I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs. Adnan Syed, the Baltimore man whose legal saga rocketed to international renown with the hit podcast Serial, could get a new trial after city prosecutors determined their predecessors withheld information about alternative suspects in the 1999 murder of Hae Min Lee. The Baltimore State's Attorney's Office moved on Wednesday to vacate Syed's conviction, according to legal papers filed in Baltimore City Circuit Court. The new motion said prosecutors on the case decades ago knew there was another suspect who threatened to kill Lee, Syed's ex-girlfriend, and neglected to disclose the information to defense attorneys, committing what's known as a Brady violation. You've got an obligation to share with the other side evidence that might be of assistance. Yeah, you can't hold it.
Right. I've seen that in movies.
And it's true.
Yeah.
Lee was strangled to death and buried in a clandestine grave in Baltimore's Leakin Park. Authorities at the time believed Syed struggled with Lee in a car before he killed and dragged her through the park. He has always maintained his innocence. A year-long investigation conducted by prosecutors and Syed's attorney uncovered new evidence, including that alternative suspects either engaged in serial rape and sexual assault or attacked a woman in a vehicle, the documents show. Prosecutors' motions also say that Lee's vehicle was located near a home associated with one of the alternative suspects. While officers of Baltimore's state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, do not concede that Syed is innocent, the prosecutor's motion says they no longer have faith in the conviction.
Wow.
Hey, we're not saying he's innocent, but we don't have faith in the conviction. So, first of all, I can't believe that it's been 7 years. It was January of 2015 when I got all caught up in this.
Well, the only reason it feels right that it was that long is that in my mind, that was when podcasting popped. Serial to me was the first time I had listened to a podcast. It was the first thing that everyone was buzzing about. Everyone was waiting for the next one to drop. My brother and his wife were obsessed with it. They got us turned on to it. And I just couldn't stop listening to it. I couldn't stop. I was caught up in it, not the way you were caught up in it.
I have a recollection. I have a recollection of being in Florida at the time, and I like always going for long walks, and usually I listen to Intelligence Squared debates on my long walks, or at least I did then. Because
pre-podcasting,
they were like 45 minutes long, which was the time of the walk, this particular route that I like to take. I have recollection of being in Florida with my family and all of a sudden dedicating, all of my daily walks to Serial, which is a spin-off of This American Life. And Sarah Koenig, who was the host of, this 12 podcast installment story arc or telling of the case of Adnan Syed. And I got totally caught up in it, but I was not buying into what other people were buying into, which was a picture of his innocence.
I was all about the entertainment factor. You were all about the legal side of it.
Well, I wrote on it and I said, quote, the combination of a whodunit, Koenig's mellifluous voice, and excellent production values has created a new age version of an old time radio play. But with its breezy presentation and cliffhangers, it is not a trial-like presentation of evidence, and it lacks the cross-examination necessary for a real search for truth, a point that might be lost on whoever is inclined to buy the merchandise free Adnan t-shirts, which were now for sale in support of Adnan Syed. So after getting caught up in it and recognizing that the prosecutor, Kevin Urick, was not a part of the serial podcast presentation, I thought, hey, I want to speak to the prosecutor.
This is the Smirconish Podcast from SiriusXM.
It's so important to prioritize your mental health and wellness every day because when you work on yourself, you'll start to see and feel positive changes in all areas of your life. The long-term effects of therapy can give you the tools to deal with challenges as they arise, strengthen your relationships, and give you a more optimistic outlook on life. There's no better time to invest in yourself than right now. TalkSpace lets you send messages to your dedicated therapist in the TalkSpace platform, which allows you to update them on the challenges and triumphs you're facing in real time. So then you don't have to wait for your next session. With TalkSpace, you set the goals with your therapist, and they hold you accountable and make sure you're really progressing. As a listener of this podcast, you'll get $100 off your first month with TalkSpace. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to TalkSpace.com. Make sure to use the code CLUB and get $100 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's CLUB and TalkSpace.com. Charging higher interest rates, that's how banks make more money, and they take a lot more of your hard-earned money if your credit score is just okay, not so great. ScoreMaster, the new science in accelerating credit scores, puts you in control of your money, not the bank. Say your credit is 700 and you're borrowing 500 grand to refi your home. Starting at ScoreMaster could save you over 75 grand over the life of your loan. That's 75 grand of your money, not the bank's. That's the genius behind the ScoreMaster 3-week rule, especially now with soaring interest rates. No matter your credit score, before you apply for any loan, auto, lease, credit, start at ScoreMaster. It only takes a minute to get started, and you can add 60 to 100 points in about 3 weeks. Life has enough regrets. Don't add paying higher interest rates to that list. Visit scoremaster.com/Michael for your special 7-day trial. Again, your special 7-day trial is waiting at scoremaster.com/Michael.
Listen to Michael live weekdays on POTUS, SiriusXM channel 124, and on the SXM app.
I thought, hey, I want to speak to the prosecutor. And I hosted him here on my radio program, the date January 15 of 2015. Do you remember me having Kevin Urick?
Absolutely, I remember that. My recollection is that he was not an easy booking at all.
Right.
He hadn't spoken to the podcast. He hadn't spoken to anybody. I don't know if he had after you, but you were definitely his first interview, possibly his only interview. And my recollection is that I made the original overtures, but you had to close the deal. You, as the sort of lawyer to lawyer, had to tell him that things were on the up and up. I just remember it being a difficult booking.
From my notes, I see that in the final episode, Sarah Koenig asks, did we just spend a year applying excessive scrutiny to a perfectly ordinary case? Yes, is the clear answer, says Michael, with a steep societal cost. I remember being very concerned about the way that the podcast had gone after a guy who provided the testimony that allowed the conviction of Adnan Syed, and I remember being troubled by the precedent that was going to set here because of so much pressure already against people, quote unquote, snitching. And then I wrote a column. In the final line of my column, I said, in the final episode, Koenig naively wonders, why would a guilty man allow me to do his story? Really, Sarah? Bob Dylan said it best. When you ain't got nothing, you got nothing else to lose. Anyway, I thought it would be a great podcast, dust off from the archives if we pulled quickly my interview with the prosecutor of this case. I'm not conversant in all the facts. I was at the time, 7 years ago, when I got swept in it. I wouldn't be able to, defend the prosecution or defend the innocence of Adnan Syed. I've lost touch with it, and I kind of want to go back and listen to this myself. And then I thought, hey, this would be a great daily podcast installment. So, for that reason, let's all listen. Kevin Urick, January 15, 2015, discussing his prosecution of Adnan Syed, who now, it seems, is going to get a new trial. All right, calling all serial fans. My next guest is Kevin Urick. He is a lawyer. He is a former prosecutor now in private practice in Maryland. Kevin Urick successfully prosecuted Adnan Syed, who's now serving life in prison for the murder of a high school classmate, a former girlfriend, Hae Min Lee. A 12-part installment on NPR about that murder case is now said to be the most successful podcast ever. In December, CNN estimated that it had been downloaded 40 million times. The basic facts: Syed was convicted in 2000 of murdering 17-year-old Hae Min Lee. Spoiler alert, in the 12th and final episode of Serial, host Sarah Koenig concludes she, quote, can't swear that he's innocent, but that most of the time, I think he didn't do it. In my opinion, and you know this if you follow me on Twitter, and I've spoken of it on my own program, from the very first episode, it's clear, at least to me, that Sarah Koenig's interest lies in giving voice to the convicted killer, whom she describes as having giant brown eyes like a dairy cow. And she wonders, could someone who looks like that really strangle his girlfriend? At least in that first episode, she catches herself and says, idiotic, I know. But then as the episodes unfold, I think her bias becomes increasingly obvious. I've written about this, a newspaper column that I will publish this coming Sunday, and I will give you chapter and verse. Nevertheless, as I speak, Syed's latest appeal is winding its way through the Maryland courts. I have a primary beef with the Serial podcast beyond the facts of just the case of Adnan Syed, and that is that it's almost an indictment of snitching. Because the linchpin of the Serial podcast, from my perspective, is the taking apart piecemeal of Jay. Jay was an accomplice of Syed after the murder, helps him bury the body. And but for his testimony, there wouldn't have been a conviction, it doesn't seem, of Syed. And I don't like the idea that we're going after someone who had the willingness, the courage to stand up and testify at trial, because but for this individual, it would seem that a murderer would be free. We have a situation at home here in Philadelphia. One guy, Caboni Savage, who was given 13 death sentences, 12 of them for murders that he ordered or had committed, including 6 relatives of an informant. The 13th was for witness retaliation. And I took note of the fact that last week in the Washington Post revealed that 37 people have been killed in the District of Columbia and Maryland, the scene of Syed's crime, since 2004 because they snitched. And yet the guy who snitched in this case, Jay, gets villainized in the podcast. So that's my thought process about Serial, the podcast. This is Kevin Urick. Hey, Kevin, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
For how many years were you a prosecutor?
Actually, I still am. I'm now in a county in Maryland where I'm part-time as a prosecutor, so I'm allowed to have a private practice on the side as well. So I still practice as a prosecutor, and I have a civil practice. I can't do criminal defense work, but I do pretty much anything civil.
For how many years have you been a prosecutor?
About 25.
Was the case of Adnan Syed one of your more memorable cases, or would you describe it as being fairly routine?
The case itself was very routine. It's memorable because the defense attorney was so hard-nosed and so aggressive.
Her name, Gutierrez, she's no longer with us, and that becomes a major part of the Serial plot line. Let me get to that subject right now. Was she at the top of her game from your perspective when you were litigating this case against her?
Definitely. She was probably the most feared defense attorney in Baltimore City from the mid-'90s to the late '90s. Because by the end of the Serial 12 episodes, a listener could easily come away with the impression that Gutierrez, your opponent, was impaired and that wounded the defense of this case. She was at the top of her game during that period. She was taking all the high-profile cases. She was paid top dollar. She only took she had her she could pick and choose which cases she took at that time. The difficulty she ran into in the Syed case is that she had no true defense that she could put on. It was impossible, based on the evidence, for an alibi to be presented because everything that they tried to do in terms of alibi, our evidence destroyed it. So she was reduced to trying to discredit the witnesses, and she spent 3 weeks trying to do that.
How many of the 12 episodes of Serial have you heard?
Actually, I have heard none. I was not aware of it being on the air until about the end of November, beginning of December, when all of a sudden I got contacted by a couple reporters who wanted me to comment about it. That was the first I had heard about it. So I'd say I heard about it maybe, what was that, 3, maybe 4 episodes before the end. I had no interest in listening to it, so I've not listened to it.
But my recollection is that on repeated occasions, I might be wrong about this, but that on repeated occasions throughout the podcast, there's reference made to attempts to get you to speak, going back to the beginning of the investigation by the NPR journalists.
I had heard about Sarah Koenig in probably the end of 2013 while the post-conviction hearing was going on. I heard about her as an NPR reporter with a program called An American Life. I knew she was talking to people about the Syed case. What I was hearing was not very favorable to her. I cannot swear that she did not try to contact me. It's possible that there was a voice message that she left that I did not respond to, but I can say, did she try to contact me multiple times? Definitely not.
So you haven't listened. Have you nevertheless read any transcripts of any of the 12 episodes?
The reporter who I gave an interview for with The Intercept gave me a brief transcript of how she was trying to handle the cell phone evidence. Other than that, all I know is a couple of things I've read.
Did you learn anything that you didn't know about the case?
From everything I've seen and everything I've read, you don't learn anything because she suppresses so much of it. She takes an issue, gives the defense argument, does not give the response, and does not tell the viewer that this has already been ruled on by a court. It's like she's emotionally trying to draw people in and sympathize with Syed. And to a certain extent, I think that's what she has to do. If she doesn't, if she comes out and says Syed is guilty, she doesn't have a program.
Well, this was one of my objections. In fact, I adopted at Twitter a hashtag of entertainment, not evidence, because I think I waited 10 hours to learn that he hadn't testified in his own behalf. And of course, I recognize I'm an attorney. I recognize his Fifth Amendment right, but that's information I would have liked to have known sooner. I think it wasn't until episode 11, I'd have to check my notes, until I learned that part of his appeal is predicated on him saying he wanted to cop a plea, and his defense lawyer didn't take that to you, the prosecutor. And I thought those were two instances where this thing was being massaged for entertainment value, not as a search for the truth.
Well, I think what probably wasn't revealed was that when we went to sentencing in the case, by that time he had dismissed Gutierrez and had a new attorney, he still stood up and said, I have consistently maintained my innocence, and I maintain it today. You know, she tried the case because that's what he wanted her to do.
Well, as of today, is the appeal in part predicated on him wanting a plea?
That's one of the things. The appeal, well, the post-conviction was ruled on in January of 2014. At that time, the trial judge that heard it denied relief on all the issues. They have filed an appeal on those issues. So, yes, that's one of the issues that will be addressed by the appellate court. I hear that they may be in the process now of either having or scheduling oral arguments on the appeal from the post-conviction.
This is the Smirconish Podcast from SiriusXM.
It's so important to prioritize your mental health and wellness every day, because when you work on yourself, you'll start to see and feel positive changes in all areas of your life. The long-term effects of therapy can give you the tools to deal with challenges as they arise, strengthen your relationships, and give you a more optimistic outlook on life. There's no better time to invest in yourself than right now. TalkSpace lets you send messages to your dedicated therapist in the TalkSpace platform, which allows you to update them on the challenges and triumphs you're facing in real time. So then you don't have to wait for your next session. With TalkSpace, you set the goals with your therapist, and they hold you accountable and make sure you're really progressing. As a listener of this podcast, you'll get $100 off your first month with TalkSpace. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to TalkSpace.com. Make sure to use the code CLUB and get $100 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's CLUB and TalkSpace.com.
Listen to Michael live weekdays on POTUS, Sirius XM channel 124, and on the SXM app.
Mr. Urick, a big part of the serial presentation is that the cell tower records don't jive with the prosecution timeline. Can you speak to that criticism?
The evidence in this case can really be broken down to very basic elements. You have, on the one hand, Jay's story, what he told us about what happened that night. Then from AT&T, we got certain types of evidence. One was the record of calls made and calls received. That allowed the police to find out who was being talked to. They were able to confirm that during the day, before school ended, Adnan's phone was in Jay's possession because everybody was talking with Jay during the course of the day. Then Jay said that around 2:45, Adnan contacted him and said, now I want you to come to me. And there is a call from a payphone to Adnan's cell phone, which was in Jay's possession at that time, right around 2:45. Then throughout the course of the evening, Adnan is taking calls or making calls. The people who were speaking to him confirmed that. But there were also at least a couple of times that Jay got on the phone, and we were able to confirm that, thus putting Jay and Adnan together throughout the entire course of the night. The other important information from that was the time of the calls, and then AT&T gave us their cell tower logs. AT&T at that time had a very primitive system compared to today. Today's cell phone towers can switch around if their cells are all tied up, so they can switch it to another cell phone tower, sometimes quite a difference away. But back in 1999, when this occurred, they did not have switching capability. If a call went through a cell phone tower, that meant you had to be in the geographical reception area for that tower. AT&T provided us with that reception area. What they did was they made a map up of southern Baltimore County, Baltimore City. They put an overlay on it with the location of their cell phone towers and then the geographical area around it in which a cell phone could be received, thus the reception area for that cell phone. Very powerful evidence. And if you read, or at least what I read in the transcript from Koenig, she spends a lot of time talking about today's cell phone towers, which have the switching capabilities. So, and she doesn't tell you that the technology is different. And most of the arguments in court today occur because it's the difference in the technology and how you can read it properly.
Well, I thought that she raised a number of questions as to whether the cell towers comported with where Syed was supposed to be according to the prosecution narrative. But the one issue that remained open, for which she could not offer an explanation, is how the cell tower put him in Leakin Park at the time that he was there burying the body with Jay. Let me spend our remaining 2 minutes asking you about Jay. A part of Serial has to do with his shifting narrative. Speak to the credibility of that witness from your perspective as the prosecutor.
Anytime that you're putting on a criminal prosecution, it's usually the person who committed the crime who picks his accomplices. We have to take the accomplices that they pick. We don't get to choose who their accomplice was. Jay was Adnan's accomplice. Jay picked him. Anytime you're dealing with someone like that, you're dealing with someone who's got things to hide, they're reluctant to tell you. You go through a process. Initially, they will deny any involvement, but then you say, hey, we've got this information over here that says you were. And then they start breaking down. They'll say, well, I was a little bit involved. And then they open up until you think that you've got a true story. You may not have a 100% accurate story because there are always things that people have to hide. You're concerned about, do I have the story about the crime that I'm going to take this on such that I can put it before a jury and let the jury decide the credibility. Jay was on the stand for 5 days with Christina Gutierrez trying to discredit him based on the corroboration of the major key points through the cell phone information. I think the jury found him as to that very credible, and they convicted Adnan.
And as I was listening to it, I was saying to myself, with my perhaps legally trained ear, if I'd killed someone and needed help burying a body, I'm not looking for a choir boy. I'm looking for the guy who was selling pot in school. Kevin Urick, thank you so much for being here. On a different occasion, maybe we'll come back and spend even more time on this, but I really appreciate your willingness to talk to me.
Thank you for having me on.
That's Kevin Urick, the prosecutor of Adnan Syed, in the case now made famous by Serial, the podcast.
Hear more of Michael Smerconish on SiriusXM's POTUS, Channel 124.
Live weekdays from 9 a.m. to noon East, or anytime on the SXM app.
Connect with Michael on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and at Smerconish.com.
Michael Smerconish, for independent minds.